So good afternoon, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Mike Wimsatt. I serve as Director of the Waste Management Division for New Hampshire DES. And I'm joined today by Leah McKenna, who's Administrator of our Solid Waste Management Bureau. And we do have a few things we'd like to present to you that I think will be responsive to the questions that you asked Representative Creighton. And I want to turn it over to Leah at this time to talk about kind of where we're at in the process and talk a little bit about that rulemaking, the formal rulemaking process.
Perfect, thank you.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. Again, Leah McKenna, and I am the Administrator of the Solid Waste Management Bureau. So when we last met in October, as you may remember, we had just sent out the actual language, proposed language that we were looking at relative to ENVSW 800, which is the landfill requirements. And we were opening an informal public input, 3-week input session, and that closed around November 8th. And so when we last spoke, we kind of outlined about a dozen of those changes. And right now, what we're doing is we're in receipt mode. So that period closed. We received comments from 14 entities. So, general public, public interest groups, industry, and consultants. Those total page-wise about 100 pages. Some of those pages are we'll say we have dozens of pages of actual comments that we're filtering through at this time. So what we're doing right now is actively reviewing those, seeing what changes we want to make based on all of those comments. And to answer your question, Representative Creighton, on timeline, the formal rulemaking portion starts when we present to the Waste Management Council. And I think I think I mentioned in October, but if I didn't, our goal is to present those at the Waste Management Council's meeting on January 18th. And so that's what kind of starts the formal rulemaking process in motion. One of the portions of the formal rulemaking process is a formal public hearing. And Director Wimsatt, that we assume that's going to happen sometime March or April. And with, again, the goal to have these rules adopted and effective on or before July 1, 2024, when the existing rules expire. So we wanted to address a couple of the questions that you had both at the last meeting. I think you kind of nailed the two, and so I'm going to turn it back over to Director Wimsatt to address those questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. And I should also note that we're joined here, not at the table, but here in the gallery. Sarah Uhas-Kern, our our Assistant Director of the Waste Division is also here. She and Leah presented to this committee last time. So we're all here and certainly happy to answer your questions. The one question that we were provided with relative to these rules was we have in the draft that was presented to the public for comment, we had established, essentially amended the rule regarding the distance of a landfill from a perennial surface water from 200 feet to 500 feet. And I believe there was I was not in attendance, but I believe there was some discussion and back and forth about that last time. And I've since received some inquiries, with some folks being concerned that, is that an arbitrary number? Is it just pulled out of the air? Is it, why is it just a number? And why isn't it some kind of performance-based standard? And I want to talk a little bit about that because I think that there may be some confusion about that. One of the things I think that was said, and we had a little bit of bad information last time, is that that 500-foot setback somehow represented an average of the surrounding states' specifications. And that's not actually true. I want to correct the record for that. So, in fact, if we're looking at states that establish a numerical setback standard in feet, this would actually be more conservative and more protective than most other states. It's or any of the other neighboring New England states, in the sense that we think that as we survey the rules of those states, it appears that they establish setbacks on the order of anywhere from 100 ranging up to 400 feet. And of course, we're proposing 500 feet. So I think it's that I just want to make sure we correct the record on that. The second thing I want to say is that it's not just a number. And when we look at that number, what we're really trying to do is we want to be sure, and there are already provisions in our rules and amendments to these rules that make it very clear that when you site your landfill, it needs to be sited in such a way relative to surface waters nearby that any release can be detected and investigated and remediated prior to that surface water body being adversely impacted by that release. And so we believe that extending from 200 to 500 feet just candidly gives you more physical space in which, and travel time in which to evaluate a release and if needed, after investigation, if there is a need for remediation, to actually have space to implement remediation and address that release so that it doesn't adversely impact the surface water. The other thing I want to mention is that it isn't just a number, in the sense that if you look at other standards that we have established already or will establish in these rules, basically a rule that states that the formation, the undisturbed soils beneath a landfill can't have a saturated hydraulic conductivity of any more than 10 to the minus 3 centimeters per second. And that's a very commonly used specification in hydrogeology. And so if you were to assume that any landfill that would be sited would need to meet that standard, and if you assume that all the soils from there to the surface water body in question meet that same minimum standard, and then you also make assumptions about average porosity and the average gradient of the groundwater table, and you do a calculation on groundwater velocity, what you really find is that represents about a 3-year travel time. It roughly works out to that. And, there's been...
I'm sorry, slow down.
Sure, I'm sorry.
I'm an artilleryman. So just say that again
Sure.
in other words.
Okay, I'm happy to do that.
Now, I did take hydrology in college, but that was before you were born. So, some of those synapses aren't firing real fast.
Well, I'm happy to say there will be no quiz, but no, I appreciate that. And in more layman's terms, if you look at the equation that you use to calculate groundwater velocity, and you make reasonable assumptions, and you assume that the formation, the soil in the area beneath the landfill all the way to the surface water body meets our minimum standards, meaning that it's no more, it doesn't transmit water any faster than required, than is the limit. And you do that calculation, you learn that 500-foot setback equates to about a 3-year travel time distance.
In what type of soil?
So that assumes a soil that is right at 10 to the minus 3 centimeters per second, which for soil type would be like a fine sand, something like that. So basically we're establishing that as a minimum standard for, you can't, what it's really trying to say is you can't site a landfill over soils that are, very porous, highly conductive gravel deposits or cobbles or anything like that. You're basically looking at finer grained soils that impede the flow of groundwater at, more so than a more conductive soil.
Okay, so if you don't mind, I'm just saying, so what you're saying is, if the water in the soil at the proposed site moves faster than 10 to the minus 3, then that site is disqualified.
That's right.
If it's slower than 10 to the minus 3, then it can proceed through the process.
It's potentially eligible. That's correct.
Okay. All right. Okay, go ahead. I'm
So
sorry.
if I could say a little more about that. So there's been a fair amount of discussion in the legislature in the last couple of years about the idea of a standard that sets a certain travel time. And one of the things that was in play in the last couple of years was the idea of Maine has a 5-year travel time, for example. And then they allow you to reduce that travel time distance by up to 2 years to make it 3 years if you have a double-lined system or if you do certain kinds of monitoring. And the fact is that New Hampshire's design standards for landfill already meet those more stringent standards. So we already require, if you're going to site a municipal solid waste landfill in New Hampshire, you have to design it with a double liner. You don't have a choice of doing a single liner. So it's not like a beyond compliance activity. That's the minimum that you need to meet. So we actually believe that what this proposed standard would be with the 500 feet, with our current design standards, and with our other language that says you've got to be able to detect, investigate, and remediate any release before it impacts surface water. We believe that taken together, those standards will be among the most protective in New England, and we think it's an appropriate way. Having said that, we're still evaluating comments and that we've received, and we have not filed an initial proposal yet. To put a finer point on what Leah said, she's absolutely right. The first sort of official rulemaking thing that we do is to submit a draft initial proposal to the Waste Management Council. But what we do following that, and after we take any input from the council, is we then file that initial proposal in the rulemaking register, and that launches the public process essentially. And then at that point, what we're directed to do, we file a fiscal impact statement with that and some other documents with the Office of Legislative Services. And then we, with the Legislative Budget Assistant. And then at that point, we schedule a public hearing. And that is actually an in-person public hearing where the public's invited to come and give oral testimony in a live setting. And then we typically would open a public comment period following that hearing, during which time the public is invited to submit written comments on the rule. And then once that comment period is closed, we take all those comments and review them, determine whether we think any adjustments or amendments to the proposed rule are warranted. And then we would proceed to draft a final proposal, which we then file with with OLS, and then that goes to eventually to a meeting at the Joint Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules for final review.
Yes,
Thank you. And thank you.
Representative Germano.
Thank you all for joining us today. So I just want to check in with a couple of things that I heard and then follow that up with a question to make sure that I understand it correctly. So when you were discussing why the 500-foot setback is not simply a number, it's not an arbitrary distance, the first thing you explained was how that distance was arrived at by looking at some of the other states in the region who use distance, right, for setback, and this gives us a more conservative number within that range. And my initial reaction was that, okay, well, that's all well and good, but that still doesn't tell me that there's science behind that number. It doesn't make it a less arbitrary number without knowing what the science is. Then you explained, given some of the average travel time, right, that works out to about 3 years travel time, right? And so that to me is compelling because that to me is an outcome that is based on science, right? So my question then is, which is obviously repeating a question I've asked before, why don't we have the regulation in travel time and not in distance? Because distance is an arbitrary number unless you then can explain it in terms of travel time. And that to me is the actual determination for distance.
That's a terrific question. Thank you, Representative Germano. And actually the answer to it is that I think goes back to some of our testimony from last year and this past session. And that is that the ability to, if we set, for example, let's say we said that you have to be at least 3 years travel time distance from any surface water body, then it would be incumbent on the applicant to gather enough hydrogeologic data to demonstrate that, which they might be able to do in certain circumstances. In other circumstances, they might not. They might not own all the land, or that's between them and the surface and every surface water in all directions. They may not be able to. And once they do it, what I've said is that kind of regulation, in my view, is a bit of a regulator's nightmare. And the reason I say that is that as a regulator, when you have a standard, you want it to be clear whether someone isn't complying with it or not. And you don't want it to be subject to a lot of argument among experts. And I can tell you that if we set a standard that looked like that, I think we would end up in a place where we'd have the applicant articulating that, yes, my placement of my landfill meets that setback, and here's the data to demonstrate why. And we'd have experts on the other side of the issue submitting arguments why that's not the right way to calculate it. And the reality is that hydrogeology is not the same as a lot of mechanical engineering problems. There's a lot more uncertainty in terms of the formation. The systems are very heterogeneous. They don't always they aren't uniform throughout the formation. And so our feeling is that with a travel time setback, we would end up with a lot of times that issue being subject to appeal, which can sometimes take a couple of years to resolve. And then they become very difficult for the courts to resolve them because in the end, they are technical arguments, not legal arguments. And one advantage of a 500-foot setback, particularly when it's tied to the technical basis that I discussed, is that most people have a hard time arguing about whether 500 feet is 500 feet. It's a pretty clear standard. And so we believe that setting a number like that, a distance like that, uses the technical protections that we want to see, but makes it much easier to implement, much more effective, and easier to enforce. And that's why we believe that's a superior approach to this than doing what you suggested.
Representative Bixby.
Yeah, so you mentioned that 500-foot setback is also combined with a requirement for a maximum porosity of the soil and conductivity of the soil, so that anything that is more porous or more conductive would make the site ineligible. Is that correct?
Yeah, and understand that 10 to the minus 3 standard applies to the formation underlying the footprint of the landfill.
Okay, and so how far out from the borders from the landfill border does that extend?
It's basically the footprint of the landfill, including really essentially the liner system and the berm that anchors the liner.
Okay, so if the area that is directly under the landfill and the liner, et cetera, meets those standards, but the area immediately outside it is more porous, would there be a risk of problems with leachate spills when the leachate was transported?
Certainly that if the area outside the landfill footprint is more porous, then contaminants in groundwater will travel faster than it would if it were less porous. We again, if you take these in concert with all the requirements, we do have a requirement that says, as I mentioned earlier, that it needs to be sited, and the hydrogeology and the study of hydrogeology of the site needs to support that a release would be able to be detected, investigated, and remediated prior to adversely impacting a surface water. And that provision is still in there and effective and operative, or regardless of what other conditions might be present or not present.
Okay, so if the soil outside the perimeter of the actual landfill footprint, which is, but is still within the property limits of the landfill owner, if that is, how would you judge whether a landfill met the requirement to be able to detect and remediate within that time frame without having some more data about what the soil is like between the landfill perimeter and the surface water body?
Typically, we're going to have more information, certainly, than just the footprint of the landfill in terms of soil type and aquifer characteristics. So our hydrogeologists would look at that information and make a judgment call as to whether it meets that standard, the standard being able to detect, investigate, and remediate.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So another question I had, and I apologize, I had I'd printed out the draft rules and I'd written all these great notes, and of course it must be in a different folder binder, so I can't reference the specific section that I have in mind. But in one area of the draft rules which provides for extra protections, and I forget, if it's around schools, hospitals, I forget, right? So my recollection is that this is 1,000-foot buffer, 500 feet of which has to be vegetated, right? There has to be vegetation. And so what I'm wondering is why that is not just a good rule. If we're going to go by feet, I understand some of the things you pointed out before about the complexities of using a simple in quotes travel time. But so if we're going to use distance, why is 1,000 foot with 500 feet being vegetated, which occurs elsewhere in rules? Why is that not a good standard for any body of water or surface water?
Sure. I think because it's apples and oranges. What we're trying to effectuate with distance from those sensitive receptors that you describe, schools and nursing homes and that sort of thing, is not about contaminant transport in groundwater in the subsurface. It's about noise and odor and vectors and that sort of thing. So it's two different. It's trying to establish a distance of setback that are providing for different types of protections.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to your 500-foot thing, because you said something, then said something else. You had mentioned in your initial opening remarks regarding the 500-foot also adding to the distance of visible area where you can identify leakage. And but that's not the primary purpose of the 500. The primary purpose of 500 is still the setback,
Right.
or is it for identification?
Well, the whole purpose of having a setback from surface water is recognizing that releases can occur. You know, you could have in the worst case scenario, you could have a liner failure and you could have leachate getting out of the liner and getting into the formation. Or you could have leachate releases because leachate is handled routinely at landfills. They're designed to collect leachate, put it into a tank, and then pump that off. And what typically happens at most landfills is that a truck comes and the tank is pumped off to a tanker truck, and the tanker truck leaves the site and goes to a wastewater treatment plant to discharge that for treatment. So releases can and do and have happened in that scenario. So the idea of the setback from surface waters is in the event that you have a release, particularly one that is not visible. So it's a liner leak, or it's some kind of a leachate collection plumbing problem that isn't obvious when it's not like you had a spill and you observed it. So the idea is that you want to have enough distance so that your regular monitoring systems, like we have groundwater monitoring wells around landfills that are intended to identify releases of contaminants to the formation and to the groundwater, so that once you have that data, you would still have time to react to it, investigate it, and identify the problem to make sure it's not ongoing, and fix it if it is. And then if there is a sufficient release that you think that it might threaten groundwater quality down gradient or the surface water, to give you time to complete an investigation of that and develop, if necessary, implement an actual active remediation, which might include pumping and treating the groundwater or treating the groundwater in situ in some way, so that you reduce the contaminants so that they don't have an adverse impact on the surface water. And the idea being that we felt, on inspection, we're looking at all of our rules now after many years and saying, we're not sure 200 feet is enough is as much as we'd like to have in order to accomplish that. Now, it needs to be said, we don't actually have record, other than for our unlined landfills, which is another matter, for the line systems that we currently are regulating that manage our waste, the double line, system, our landfills that have leachate collection, we don't have a history here of surface waters being adversely impacted by those landfills. But having said that, we want to be as protective as we can be within reason. And we think that expanding that 200 to 500 feet gives us more travel time and more, frankly, just physical distance in which to make an evaluation and then implement a remedy if that's needed.
So, and I'm there's an ongoing discussion right now on the leakage into the Ammonoosuc.
Right.
How does that relate to the lining that you just
Sure. No, I'm
discussed?
glad you asked the question, because I know it's on a lot of people's minds. And actually, we will later this week be releasing a letter that explains the agency's position on that. That's a complex matter. You're making reference to the NCES landfill in Bethlehem at the northeast corner of the landfill, where there's a lot of history that the facility's been expanded there. But prior to the early 1990s, there was an unlined landfill at that site that was operated by others, not the current owners. And that had some significant adverse impacts on the groundwater in that area. I'm not sure there are documented impacts to the Ammonoosuc River itself, even from that facility, but there certainly were adverse impacts on groundwater quality around that landfill. And back in the early 1990s, when NCES was looking to expand that landfill and construct a line system there, they agreed to basically pick up that entire unlined landfill, all the waste in that unlined landfill, and place it into a line system on the same site. Now, when you do that, you have a great impact. It absolutely improves things because now you no longer have that waste that is where the release of contaminants from that waste are not impeded by anything because there's no liner. You now put it in a line system where you can collect the leachate and properly manage it. But you can't undo what's been done to the soil and the formation and the groundwater at the site. So we've been monitoring. We have a system whenever we have a site, whether it's a landfill or some hazardous waste site, we have a mechanism called a groundwater management permit, which is issued for the site, which requires that a network of groundwater monitoring wells be regularly monitored and evaluated to sort of make sure that the remedy, in this case, picking up the landfill and putting it in a line system, has been effective at reducing contamination and restoring groundwater in the area. And so we've had a groundwater management permit for that landfill for many years, and we continue to monitor it. It has had impacts, there's no question. Most of the impacts were related to what we call volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, which were in much greater concentrations many years ago. Most of those have declined, as we would expect, because we picked up the landfill over time and either gone to very low or non-detect concentrations. There are two contaminants, however, that we tend to see persisting at those kinds of sites. One of them is 1,4-dioxane, which is something we've known about for a number of years, but we have more recently established a much lower standard, a drinking water standard for it. It is actually a compound that was used commonly as a stabilizer for chlorinated solvents. It was also used in household products, or at least it was there present as a contaminant in household products. And it's very persistent. It does not break down like most other VOCs. So we do tend to see 1,4-dioxane lingering in the groundwater environment much longer than the other VOCs. And that has been the case here, although even that has been declining. And then the other one is a much newer contaminant for us, and that's something everybody's heard of, PFAS. And so the issue with PFAS is that they're also extremely persistent. They do not break down readily in the groundwater environment, but they also are regulated at extremely low concentrations, where we regulate almost all the VOCs that we regulate in the parts per billion range, or micrograms per liter. We regulate PFAS, and for PFOA, for example, at 12 parts per trillion, which is nanograms per liter, which is 3 orders of magnitude lower. So we tend to see PFAS at virtually every landfill in New Hampshire. Almost all the online landfills have it as present as a contaminant, even those that long since saw their VOC concentrations go away. And we do see it at our line systems as well. And in many cases, that is attributed to not necessarily a leak in the liner, but releases of leachate. Because it's in leachate, when you have a release of leachate at a site, you will get some. And just candidly, I mean, trucks, driving in and tipping their waste, PFAS is so prevalent in our environment that there are a lot of ways that PFAS can get into the groundwater at a waste facility. Now, what we're seeing in the Amanuensis, in that part of the landfill, is that we see, not surprisingly, concentrations of PFAS in groundwater that we believe are associated with the former unlined landfill. There are other monitoring wells where we believe there may be PFAS as a result of former known and responded to releases of leachate during leachate handling. And we've asked actually for additional work at around those wells to evaluate that. One of the things that's been alleged is that there, as I said, it's a complicated area of the site. At this northeast part of the landfill, there's also a series of groundwater seeps. And a groundwater seep is, most of us have seen this somewhere. You see groundwater just emanating from the edge of a slope or something like that. And it's just an expression of the groundwater table in many cases coming out when you have a change in topography. It comes out on the landfill, or on the face of the soil. In this case, we have what we call the main seep, which is not very subtle. It's about, I think it's been estimated at more than 60 gallons a minute many times, depending on the time of the year. So it's a significant discharge of groundwater on the surface of the ground. It forms a channel, and then that channel conveys that water to the Amanuensis River. And one of the unfortunate situations is that probably as a result of geochemical conditions that were caused by the unlined landfill, but also just the actual geologic conditions there, the the water that comes out of that seep is very iron rich. And when it's full of dissolved iron. And when it hits the oxidizing conditions of the air in the open air, a lot of that iron gets oxidized and becomes insoluble in that water, so it precipitates out. And any of us who've wandered about have seen this. If you ever come across groundwater or water on the ground or in a pond or even just coming out of a culvert, you'll see where it discharges just this gross sort of looking rusty colored
yeah.
film. And that's the result of iron bacteria that process that. It's a precipitated iron, and then the iron bacteria will sometimes have waste products that almost look like a petroleum sheen, but it's not actually petroleum, so it's got that rainbow sheen. And we respond to dozens of complaints about this every year all across the state, often from just purely naturally occurring conditions. But anyways, at the seep, it's happened in spades. It's really quite disgusting looking and noticeable. It caused a lot of concern on the part of the public, and we actually entered into agreement with NCES many years ago to remediate the seep, in which they basically took all that whole area where the seep discharges and then it goes down to the river, and we had them pull it all up because it looked terrible, and then line it with rocks and basically try to make it look better. It didn't work very well because the water coming out of that seep was still loaded with iron. And so within a few weeks or months, it looked kind of the same as it did before.
But iron
This
as
is
opposed to PFAS.
Right, naturally occurring.
Greater than
I
12
apologize. I'm
parts per
getting there.
trillion.
I'm just trying to give
Okay.
you some context. So this is an area that's been of great interest to a lot of people because it looks pretty ugly. There are other seeps that aren't quite as substantial as the main seep. We have required NCES to monitor the groundwater or the water quality in those seeps over time, and we basically the most recent sampling, we don't see VOCs in them, but we did detect in a couple of the seeps, not the main seep, but in a couple of the seeps, low concentrations in the parts per trillion range of PFAS, and it's been alleged that that somehow has contaminated the Ammonoosuc River. During that same monitoring period, we also took samples from the Ammonoosuc Channel, in the river channel, in the river water, in 3 locations near those discharges, and we do not detect PFAS in any of those samples. So what I want to make clear is that we don't believe that the Ammonoosuc River is being adversely impacted by the discharges that are associated with those seeps. And the seeps, essentially, you can't stop them. They're going to run, the water's going to go there. We continue to monitor them, and we'll do that into the future, but we don't have reason to believe. So the data that we obtained from the seeps did not surprise us because those seeps represent groundwater quality. And we already knew we had PFAS in groundwater there. And so it's not a surprise that some of those seeps have detectable levels of PFAS in them. But they're not at a concentration that we believe is having any adverse impact on the quality of the water in the Ammonoosuc River.
Representative Bixby.
Yeah, so does I assume that it's some sort of an aquifer that leads to the seep from whatever the source of the groundwater is. Does that aquifer run under the landfill or is it adjacent to the landfill?
It does run under it in the sense that when the unlined landfill was removed and placed in a line system was subsequently placed over the footprint of that former unlined landfill. So there's a line portion of the landfill that overlies certainly at least some of the groundwater that contributes to, probably groundwater that contributes to the discharges in the seep.
And so you're providing a response paper.
There will be a letter response coming later this week. That's correct.
Okay. And any other questions?
Thank you. Just as another one of those, make sure that I heard you correctly and I understand the explanation. So the way I pose this question in my mind is, what would a leak look like, right? As opposed to what you're seeing, right? So what I'm hearing is that what you're seeing is consistent with typical groundwater quality levels of the things you're testing for, as opposed to what would a leak look like qualitatively, right? That makes you feel confident that that is not what is happening here.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Well, so first of all, I would say, having PFAS and 1,4-dioxane at any concentration in water, I hope we don't get to a place where we say that's a normal level, because we certainly have groundwater in the state where we don't detect PFAS, and that's the way we want it. So, but in terms of the conditions and the history of the site where it housed an unlined landfill, it doesn't surprise us that we're seeing those concentrations. So I want to be clear about that. But it's a great question. So what would, if we were concerned that there were a liner leak, what would the groundwater data be that would lead us to that conclusion? And the answer is that there are a number of geochemical parameters and volatile organic compounds that we would see significant changes in. So there are VOCs in leachate, and there are leachate is very relatively strong solution. It's got a lot of contaminants in it from the landfill. So if we had a liner leak there where the leachate was actually leaking, we would expect to see chlorides. We'd expect to see increases in certain geochemical parameters, oxidizing condition, pH, but also the presence of volatile organic compounds that shouldn't be in groundwater anywhere, that would be part of leachate. And when we have seen leachate releases before, we don't have a situation where we had a liner leak that we're aware of, but when we've seen leachate releases as a result of a mistake in pumping off a tank or something like that in an accident, we tend to see the impacts from that tend to include not just PFAS or 1,4-dioxane, but VOCs, those other geochemical parameters, and that's not what we're seeing in the groundwater data or the SEEP data that we've collected most recently.
So what you're seeing looks like residual old stuff that was left over from the previous one, not what you would normally see in an active landfill.
Right. Primarily, we believe we're looking at effects of the old unlined landfill. We do have some concerns that, folks are aware that there was a leachate release that occurred, not from a liner leak, but from an accident with a mechanical failure. We've been investigating that. We think that the effects of that were largely mitigated by what was done in the days immediately following the release. But we do have some concerns that we're following up on, and this is something that's always ongoing at every landfill, where we see some data, we have some concerns about it, and we ask for further hydrogeological work to assess it. And in fact, we responded to those most recent submittals from the company that I've been talking about, the data they collected, with a letter that was dated November 7th, which laid out some additional work that we'd like the company to do to evaluate some of the data that we're seeing in a couple of those wells. So there's still more work going on, but nothing we've seen suggests that we have a failure of the liner system.
Okay. Any further questions? Yeah, every word of it. Okay, so based on the 18 January meeting, when would you recommend that we have our next discussion on rules, before or after that meeting?
Well, I think probably after and again, I want to say we're going to do our level best to get those ready for a review or for your presentation to the Waste Management Council on the 18th of January. We've got legal review. We've got to complete the rules draft. We've got to get legal review completed. And, we have a lot of moving parts right now. We have many chapters. So we're going to do our very best to do that. If we stay on that schedule, then, at that point, the whole process becomes, it's been pretty public already, but it becomes very public at that point.
Right.
The draft is published in the rulemaking register. It goes out to a hearing and public comment. And then really, everything that happens in there will be evident to anybody who's looking on. But we're certainly happy to come and provide an update to this subcommittee whenever it pleases you. Obviously, we'll be in the session at that point, so we'll be here pretty frequently on other bills. And if it would be helpful and you want to certainly, if it's your pleasure, if you want to schedule an update, we'd be happy to accommodate.
Okay, Representative Bixby.
Yeah, so I have a question that it's doesn't have to do with the spill. It's just in terms of whether something is dealt with in the rules at all or not, and whether it's something that would could be dealt with just in rules or whether it would require more legislation. So I was told that Turnkey in Rochester does a certain amount of pre-treatment of the leachate before they send it off to municipal waste plants. And that is and that step reduces the amount of PFAS and other contaminants that end up going into the municipal waste processing, which would then potentially end up in the biosolids. And I was wondering if there is any place in the rules that does or could require that sort of pre-treatment at all landfills.
There's nothing in the rules that requires the landfill to pre-treat their leachate on site. There are rules that make it very clear that a landfill has to have at least 2 identified facilities that can accept all of their leachate. The idea being that, leachate keeps coming whether you want it or not. You got to be able to collect it and get it shipped off site for proper treatment every day, basically. So it's an important, institutional thing for a landfill to have established that they've got an outlet for their leachate. And if for some reason one of those outlets, a wastewater treatment plant goes down for a week, they need to have another facility where they can bring the leachate to while they wait for that one to come back online. In the case of Turnkey, the story behind that, as I understand it, and certainly the company officials could give you probably a more accurate view, but my understanding is that they were, it's a big landfill, it generates a lot of leachate, and they have a number of places where they send their leachate, one of which is just to the local Rochester wastewater treatment plant. And it turned out that, as I understand it, Rochester had a UV disinfection equipment for their final treatment of their treated effluent before they discharged to the river at the plant site. And there was something in the leachate from Turnkey landfill that was blinding that in a way that it wasn't becoming effective for disinfection. So the city of Rochester asked them to pre-treat their leachate to remove that compound to make sure that it wouldn't frustrate their treatment and disinfection processes. So they did that many years ago so that the leachate that they sent to Rochester wastewater treatment plant would be acceptable and it wouldn't cause the Rochester plant to violate any of its permits. In the meantime, so they have a pretty sophisticated wastewater treatment plant at Turnkey. And if you've ever toured it, it's pretty impressive. There's quite a lot of infrastructure there to accomplish that. As it turns out, they do a step called reverse osmosis on the tail end of that. There's a variety of treatment processes that they subject the leachate to. But on the final polishing, they actually submit it to reverse osmosis. It turns out reverse osmosis is a really good method for treating PFAS. And so when they were implementing that regular treatment, it was really pulling out a lot of the PFAS. Now, it's not perfect because it means that it doesn't destroy it. It just, it concentrates it, if you will, into what's called the rejectate in reverse osmosis water treatment terms. And then they have to find a place to take that.
Right.
So there's a lot of stories about how that unfolded. And so long story short, Turnkey is doing that. There are other landfills around the country that are looking at this. I think that what's happening so far is that to the extent that landfills are choosing to pre-treat on site, in some cases around the country, it's because the wastewater treatment plants where they bring their leachate have asked them to do so. It's not something that's required in most states' rules, and it's not required in our rules. It's something I think we are looking at, and we probably should look at in the future. I do want to point out that it's a double-edged sword, because one advantage of collecting leachate at a landfill site, putting it in a truck and getting it off the site is that you minimize the handling of it. It basically it gets collected, it goes to a tank, you offload that to a tank truck, and off it goes. If you build infrastructure on the site, you have the added concern, well, what if you have a release from your treatment infrastructure? So I haven't really kind of figured out where we ought to be on it, to be honest with you. It's something that I think is, different people reasonable people could take opposing views on something like that, about whether that's the right thing to do or not. And I think that, as time goes on, we'll learn more about it. And I think that, the market may drive it even if we didn't drive it through a regulatory direction. because wastewater treatment plants may find themselves in a place where they don't want leachate that has PFAS in it, and they may ask for pretreatment. There's also been discussion about the idea of a regional pretreatment facility that would be separate from a landfill site, but would be constructed primarily to take leachate from landfills and pre-treat it, and either do a full treatment there and discharge it, or pre-treat it in some fashion and then ship it to other wastewater treatment plants for further treatment and discharge. So it's a complex question, but it's definitely something we're thinking about.
Right. I guess one of my concerns is, since one of the concerns of this committee is the presence of PFAS in soils, and one of the avenues for that is spreading of biosolids, and one of the avenues for contamination of biosolids is that leachate being processed in
Yes.
water treatment plants, and so we don't want to have a vicious cycle of the PFAS, being brought from the landfill to the water treatment plant, and then having that contaminate the biosolid, which then is spread on land.
Right. No, it's definitely a concern, and one of the things we're looking at right now is what standards we should set. We did a lot of work on this over the last couple of years to determine what standards we should establish for, maximum concentrations of PFAS in biosolids if they're destined for land application. So that's something that's still in process right now. If we talk to the landfill operators, they believe that the lion's share of PFAS that they get in their leachate comes from the disposal of, believe it or not, textiles, carpets, and things like that have been treated with PFAS containing cleaners and treatments, and that because they represent, you have to look at the mass balance too, right?
Yeah.
And, when it comes to what goes into an MSW landfill, there's a lot of textiles that go into one. And so I'm not sure anybody knows for sure, but I think that the landfill operators suspect that that's a major source of the PFAS in their leachate. There's definitely a movement afoot to get PFAS out of a lot of consumer and industrial and commercial products. And as we make progress in that regard, the concentration of PFAS in leachate should go down. But it's important to keep in mind, it's not going to happen fast or overnight, because the MSW in our landfills is old, and it's, and it's what it is, and it's going to continue to generate leachate for many years to come, for sure.
Yep.
Thank you. Out of curiosity, where does the kind of concentrated PFAS, when they remove it, and then you said that obviously still needs to be disposed of, it can't be destroyed, but I'm just curious,
Yeah, no.
where does that go?
It's a great question. I think right now, and I don't like to ever speak for the company, particularly when I don't know the answer for sure, but the last I heard from company officials, that was going to another one of their facilities in New York State for further treatment and disposal. At one point, the rejectate was actually going down to a wastewater treatment plant in Massachusetts for treatment and discharge, which, for reasons you can imagine, didn't sit very well once people understood that, and then they started sending it out of state to a facility in New York State.
We good? You good? All right. Well, anything from the folks out in the hinterland there? Madam Chair.
Sorry.
When you were talking about the leachate being sent out to another facility and they process it or whatever, is that what other states do as well? How do other states handle these, the leachates and
Leachate from
processing?
landfills?
Yeah.
My understanding is that in virtually every case, leachate from landfills is offloaded.
You don't have to speak in
Oh,
that.
I'm sorry. My understanding is that in all cases, virtually every case, unless it's treated on site, leachate from landfills is collected in tank trucks and trucked to nearby or sometimes distant municipal wastewater plants where it's treated and discharged.
And other states do those, the same thing.
That's correct. That's my understanding.
Okay, so I do have one last question. From the work that you guys are doing, a lot of detail, a lot of attention to detail. What do you need from us at the legislature at this point?
I don't think there's anything in particular. I mean, we know, we have a job to do. We've got, our rules are due to be updated by July 1 of 2024, and we're going to do our best to meet those deadlines. And really, we just need to keep our heads down and keep working at it right now.
Okay,
Actually,
yeah,
so along the same lines, I had a call from Senator Waters, and he was going to talk with Commissioner Scott, and I don't know what the result of his conversation was, but the question was whether there was going to, whether more funding was needed in order to make, in order to enable you to finish this rules process.
Well, I think certainly this, it has to be said, this is a monumental effort. We you know, having virtually all of our rules expire at the same time is not a great plan, right? And what we want to do, the rules are in effect for 10 years. And so once you do them, you sort of get into that routine. But what we'd like to do very likely over time, with the ability of time to think about it and plan for it, is to start amending certain chapters on a staggered schedule. So we don't have all of a sudden 20 chapters of the same set of rules all come due at the same time. It's been a tremendous burden, I will tell you that. We have staff who are working really hard on it, and I can't tell you how thankful I am that they're so dedicated and capable. Having said that, you know, now we're in the home stretch here. We got a lot of work to do. An appropriation of money, we probably wouldn't even be able to get someone hired and trained to help us in time. If we'd had that 5 years ago, we'd certainly make use of it right now. I think it's no secret that our solid waste program has been kind of sort of chronically underfunded for many, many years and resulted in a lot of struggles in terms of keeping up with our workload and getting things done. I'm happy to say we have seen an influx of funding that has helped us you know, hire staff. You know, recruiting staff and keeping staff is difficult for everybody right now, so that is what it is. But to the extent we can maintain the staff that we have and get our work done, I think we're going to be okay. There's a lot of demands being placed on us as an agency with regard to solid waste that maybe weren't a few years ago. So we may need to look at that and having, you know, more staffing. But for the time being, in terms of dealing with this immediate problem, the rulemaking, I don't think additional funding would be that helpful to us.
Okay, so I think he was looking at using one of the bills that had been retained by the Senate, and I think that it sounds like the appropriate place for this would be the next biennial budget.
I think that's right. And I will say, you know, I think certainly we could, I'm not going to tell you we got everything we need. If we had, you know, another landfill permit engineer and another compliance inspector, that would be really helpful. We did lose our rulemaking person to illness for many, many months, and that really hurt us. That's not something that, you know, an appropriation or anything else can help. That's just bad luck, and that's when you manage people, that's what happens.
Yeah.
You know, certainly we'd be happy to engage in that discussion in the next biennium, for sure. I appreciate the question.
well, thank you all for your hard work, and we will not bother you until after the 18th, recognizing you're crunching on all that. But probably before the end of January, we'll have our next subcommittee just to check in with you, see how that goes, and see how your public hearings are going.
We look forward to it.
All right?
All right.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You bet.
Have a great day. Merry Christmas.
So I have a quick question for the committee as a member, as a